In November 3rd, 1942, 11:47 p.m., Corporal Robert Bobby Henshaw crouched in a drainage ditch outside Mersa Matruh, Egypt, watching a German armored car approach at 30 miles per hour. He had 60 seconds before the Stieg Kfz. Tu reached his position. In his hands, 15 feet of fence wire twisted around 2 tent stakes. No mine, no explosive, no official authorization. In the next 4 minutes, he would prove that sometimes the simplest weapons are the ones nobody thinks to ban. The Western Desert didn't care about doctrine. It cared about results. Henshaw was 23 years old, born in Youngstown, Ohio, where his father worked the blast furnaces at Republic Steel. Bobby had grown up in the shadow of those furnaces, learning that metal had moods. Hot metal moved. Cold metal cracked. Stressed metal remembered. His father had taught him to feel tension through gloves, to know when a cable would snap before it showed visible wear. Bobby had spent his teenage years in the rail yards, replacing coupling chains, rigging emergency brakes on runaway ore cars. He'd learned that stopping something heavy didn't always require matching its force. Sometimes you just needed to find the weak point and apply pressure where it wasn't expected. He'd enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Army Corps of Engineers. They'd shipped him to North Africa in July, handed him a shovel, and told him to dig. Trenches, tank traps, latrines. Nobody had asked about the rail yards. By October, the British 8th Army was pushing west after El Alamein. Rommel's Africa Corps was retreating. But retreating didn't mean defeated. German reconnaissance units still prowled the coastal roads at night. SD Kfz 222 armored cars, light, fast, four-wheeled killers with a 20mm autocannon and an MG-34 machine gun. They'd slip through defensive lines, shoot up supply columns, vanish before anyone could respond. Standard doctrine said you needed mines or anti-tank guns to stop them. Mines took time to lay. Anti-tank guns were loud, visible, and attracted artillery fire. The British had lost 43 trucks in 2 weeks. American supply convoys lost another 17. The armored cars would appear at dusk, rake a convoy with cannon fire, disappear into the desert. You'd find the trucks burning, drivers dead in their seats, cargo scattered across the sand. The cars were too fast for pursuit, too alert for ambush. They never used the same route twice. Sergeant Frank Morrison had been driving a deuce and a half on October 28th. Bobby had known him since basic training. Morrison was from Akron, worked in a tire factory before the war, could roll cigarettes one-handed while driving. He'd been hauling ammunition to a forward artillery position. The SDO Kfz had caught his convoy at twilight, 3 miles outside Mersa Matruh. The 20mm shells punched through the truck's cab like it was cardboard. Morrison had tried to bail out. The machine gun got him before his boots hit the ground. Bobby had been part of the recovery detail. They'd found Morrison face down in the sand, still clutching his cigarette tin. The sand around him was dark, almost black in the moonlight. Bobby had rolled him over. Morrison's eyes were open, surprised. There were 7 bullet holes in his chest, close enough together that Bobby could cover them with one hand. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with blood. Morrison's uniform was soaked through, heavy. When they lifted him onto the stretcher, the fabric made a wet sound. Bobby's hands had shaken so badly, he'd dropped Morrison's dog tags twice before getting them into the collection bag. That night, Bobby couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Morrison's face. That surprised expression. Bobby kept thinking about the cigarette tin still clutched in Morrison's hand. He'd been planning to smoke after the delivery. Just one more run. Just one more cigarette. Simple things. The kind of things that make you think you'll live forever. Bobby sat up in his tent at 2 a.m., hands still shaking. He could smell diesel fuel, even though he'd scrubbed his hands raw. Morrison had been 24, had a wife in Akron. Her name was Dorothy. She made apple pies. Morrison had talked about those pies constantly. Bobby realized he'd have to write to her. Tell her that Frank had died quick, that he hadn't suffered. Both lies. Frank had suffered. Bobby had seen the drag marks in the sand where Morrison had tried to crawl. 10 feet of blood trail before the machine gun had finished him. The next morning, Bobby had watched another convoy roll out. Same route. Same vulnerable trucks. Different drivers, but same surprised faces. Same wives waiting back home. Same cigarette tins in their pockets. He couldn't watch another man die. The problem was simple. Armored cars had 4 wheels. 4 wheels needed traction. Traction required all wheels touching the ground simultaneously. The SDIG KFZ 222 weighed 4.8 tons, distributed across a wheelbase of 116 inches. Its ground clearance was 10 inches. Its tires were 7.50 20 combat treads, hard rubber designed for desert sand. But the differential was exposed underneath, connecting the rear axle. Protected by thin armor plate, yes, but exposed. Bobby had mentioned it to Lieutenant Cooper during a supply run. "Sir, what if we could stop them without mines? Trip them up somehow?" Cooper had been filling out requisition forms. "Trip up an armored car?" "Yes, sir. Something across the road. Cable or wire. Catch the axle." Cooper hadn't even looked up. "Henshaw, those cars weigh 5 tons. Any wire strong enough to stop them would require winches to deploy. By the time you set it up, they'd be gone. Besides, they'd see it. Forget it." Bobby had tried again the next day with Captain Matthews. Same response. Armored cars moved too fast. Wire would snap. Even if it held, the crew would just reverse and go around. Doctrine said you needed explosives. Doctrine had been written by people who'd never worked a rail yard. On November 2nd, another convoy got hit. 6 trucks, 11 men dead. Bobby had helped pull bodies from the wreckage. One driver had been decapitated by a 20mm shell. His head was still in his helmet, rolling in the sand 15 feet from his body. Bobby had picked it up. It was lighter than he'd expected. Empty. That's what death made you. Empty and light. That night, Bobby sat in the motor pool, staring at a coil of fence wire. Standard issue, used for perimeter defense. 1/4-inch steel wire, woven in figure-8 braids. Tensile strength, wire 200 pounds. Not enough to stop a 5-ton vehicle. But Bobby wasn't thinking about stopping it dead. He was thinking about the rail yards in Youngstown. About runaway ore cars. You didn't stop them with brakes. You derailed them, lifted one wheel off the track. Same weight, same momentum, but once a wheel left the rail, friction did the rest. An armored car wasn't much different. 4 wheels, independent suspension. If you could lift one wheel, even for a moment, the car would lose balance. 5 tons distributed across 3 wheels instead of 4. The suspension couldn't compensate fast enough, not at 30 miles per hour. The car would tilt, catch sand, slow down, maybe flip if the angle was right. The trick wasn't stopping the car. The trick was interrupting its balance. Bobby looked at the wire, then at the tent stakes in the supply crate beside him. 16-inch steel stakes, sharp points, designed to hold tents in desert wind. He picked one up, felt the weight, 12 ounces. He drove it into the sand with a mallet. Solid. Wouldn't pull free under tension. He calculated quickly. SDKAFZ. 222 wheelbase, 116 inches. Ground clearance, 10 inches. If he strung wire between 2 stakes, positioned them 20 feet apart at 30-degree angles to the road, the wire would cross the road at bumper height. 6 inches off the ground. Low enough that headlights wouldn't catch it. High enough to catch under the front axle as the car passed over. The wire wouldn't stop the car, but it would lift the front right wheel. Just for a second, maybe 2. At 30 miles per hour, that was enough. The suspension would compress on the left side, extend on the right. The car would start to tip. The driver would overcorrect. The rear wheels would lose traction in the sand. The car would slew sideways, present its thin side armor to anyone with a rifle. Bobby had cut 15 feet of fence wire with bolt cutters. The wire was stiff, hard to bend. He'd wrapped it around his fingers to test tension. The wire cut into his skin, left red marks. Good. That meant it wouldn't stretch much under load. He'd twisted one end around a tent stake using his work gloves. The wire was cold, even through leather. He could feel the individual braids under his fingers. Each twist required effort. The wire didn't want to bend. By the time he'd secured both stakes, his thumbs were bleeding where the wire had cut through the gloves. He'd worked until 3 a.m. Nobody questioned why a combat engineer was working alone in the motor pool. Engineers were always fixing something. The work was simple, but required precision. Measure the angles, calculate the height, test the tension. Bobby had pulled the wire taut between the stakes, felt the resistance. 1,200 pounds of tensile strength. The stakes were rated for 500 pounds of lateral force each. The math worked. Barely. If the wire held for 2 seconds, the car would lose balance. If it held for 3, the car would flip. The court-martial risk was clear. Improvised weapons were prohibited without authorization. Booby traps violated the Geneva Convention. If this failed, if someone got killed, Bobby would spend the war in a military prison. Dishonorable discharge. Prison time after the war. His father would never understand. His mother would never forgive him. Bobby had sat there in the dark, hands cramping from the wire work, and thought about Morrison, about Dorothy and her apple pies, about the next convoy, about more cigarette tins in the sand. He'd loaded the wire and stakes into a canvas bag. He said nothing to anyone. The next night, November 3rd, Bobby had volunteered for perimeter patrol. Nobody wanted night watch in the desert. Too cold, too dark, too many scorpions. The sergeant had been grateful. Bobby had walked the perimeter until 11 p.m., then slipped through a gap in the defensive positions. He'd moved south toward the coastal road, the road the armored cars used. He'd found a spot where the road curved around a wadi. The curve would force cars to slow down, 15 miles per hour instead of 30. Better odds. He'd positioned the stakes on both sides of the road, 20 feet apart, angled 30 degrees inward. The wire stretched between them, 6 inches above the sand, invisible in the darkness. He'd tested the tension. The wire thrummed when he plucked it, like a guitar string. He'd packed sand around the stakes, made them look like rocks, natural, unnoticed. Then he'd hidden in a drainage ditch 30 yards away and waited. The desert at night was never silent. Wind moved sand constantly. Rocks cooled, contracted, made clicking sounds. Scorpions hunted, their legs scratching on stone. Bobby lay in the ditch, rifle across his lap, and listened. His breath fogged in the cold. The temperature had dropped from 90 degrees at sunset to 40 degrees now. His uniform was damp with sweat that had frozen at the collar. The sand under him was cold enough to hurt. He could feel it through his clothes, leaching heat from his body. At 11:43 p.m., he heard the engine, distant, getting closer. The distinctive whine of a Horch engine, 8 cylinders, liquid-cooled. The Sau KKF's 222 used the same engine as German staff cars. Bobby had heard it before, during recovery operations after Morrison died. The sound made his hands shake. He pressed himself flat in the ditch. The wire was invisible. He couldn't see it anymore. Had he positioned it correctly? Was it too high? Too low? Would the car see it? Headlights appeared around the curve. One vehicle, moving slowly, 20 miles per hour. The car was painted desert tan, almost invisible against the sand. Bobby could see the turret rotating slowly, scanning for threats. The 20mm autocannon pointed forward. The machine gun pointed right. The crew was alert. The car approached the wire. 50 feet. 40. 30. Bobby held his breath. His heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat. 20 feet. The car's front bumper reached the wire. The wire caught under the front axle, exactly where Bobby had calculated. For half a second, nothing happened. The wire stretched, went taut, sang with tension. Then the front right wheel lifted. 6 inches, 8, 10. The car tilted left. The suspension compressed. The driver felt it, tried to correct, turned the wheel right. But the rear wheels were still on the ground, still pushing forward at 20 miles per hour. The car slewed sideways. The front left wheel dug into the sand. The rear right wheel left the ground. The car flipped. It happened fast. The car rotated 90 degrees, went over on its side, crashed into the sand with a sound like a bell, being hit with a sledgehammer. The turret dug a furrow. The wheels spun free. The engine screamed, then died. Bobby waited. 5 seconds. 10. The turret hatch opened. A German crewman climbed out, coughing. Then another. 3 total. They were disoriented, stumbling. One had blood on his face from hitting something inside. They were 30 yards away, standing beside their overturned vehicle, trying to figure out what had happened. Bobby raised his rifle. His hands weren't shaking anymore. Hände hoch! He'd learned that phrase from a British sergeant. Hands up. The Germans froze, looked around, couldn't see where the voice was coming from. Bobby stepped out of the ditch, rifle aimed. Hände hoch! Now! They raised their hands. Bobby kept the rifle on them while he whistled twice. Sharp. The signal for patrol. 30 seconds later, 2 British soldiers appeared from the defensive line, rifles ready. They'd heard the crash. Bobby pointed at the prisoners. They're yours. The British sergeant stared at the overturned armored car, at the wire still stretched across the road, at the tent stakes. What the bloody hell did you do? Bobby pulled the wire free from the stakes, coiled it up. Stopped an armored car. With fence wire? Yes. The sergeant walked around the overturned vehicle. The front axle was bent. The right front wheel was missing 3 lug nuts, torn off when the car flipped. The turret was jammed, unable to rotate. The whole vehicle was intact, but immobile. A perfect capture. How did you know this would work? Bobby shrugged. I worked rail yards. Same principle. The sergeant looked at him for a long moment. You're out of your mind. Bobby didn't argue. By morning, the story had spread through the motor pool. By afternoon, it had reached the artillery positions. By evening, combat engineers from 3 different companies were asking Bobby how to set the wire trap. He'd shown them the angles, the stakes, the tension, the positioning. Each demonstration took 5 minutes. He'd done it 11 times that day. His hands were raw from handling wire. His voice was hoarse from explaining the same details over and over. The officers didn't know. The trap wasn't authorized. There was no documentation, no requisition forms, no official approval. Just engineers whispering to each other in motor pools and defensive positions. Just wire and stakes appearing at curve points along known patrol routes. On November 8th, another SDKF's Doom-22 got caught. Different location, same result. The car flipped, crew captured alive. On November 12th, 2 more. On November 19th, 3 in one night. The Germans started avoiding the coastal roads. They couldn't figure out what was happening. Their cars were designed to handle mines. They had belly armor for explosives, but they kept flipping for no visible reason. They'd examine the wreckage, find the wire, but couldn't understand how wire could flip a 5-ton vehicle. The math seemed impossible. German after-action reports started mentioning it. American units employing unconventional road denial systems. Nature unknown. Recommend extreme caution on known supply routes. One German reconnaissance commander, Hauptmann Klaus Richter, encountered the wire trap personally on November 15th. His car had swerved around it at the last second. He'd stopped, examined it, filed a detailed report. Simple steel wire, positioned to catch front suspension. Effectiveness disproportionate to simplicity. Recommend counter-tactics immediately. But there were no effective counter-tactics. Driving slowly helped, but slow reconnaissance was useless reconnaissance. Spotters couldn't see the wire at night. Metal detectors didn't work because the wire wasn't buried. The only solution was to avoid the roads entirely, which defeated the purpose of having fast reconnaissance vehicles. The psychological impact was worse than the physical. German crews became cautious, hesitant. They'd scan the roads for minutes before proceeding. They'd send dismounted infantry ahead to check for traps. By the time they'd cleared a route, Allied forces had already repositioned. The STI KFZ 222s, designed for speed and aggression, became slow and defensive. Their main advantage disappeared. Radio intercepts confirmed it. Advise all units, American wire traps confirmed on routes 7, 14, and 22. Proceed with extreme caution. Dismount and inspect curves before proceeding. Another intercept. Lost 3 cars this week. All flipped. Crews survived, but vehicles destroyed. Request alternative reconnaissance methods. The statistics told the story. October 1942. 43 British trucks lost. 17 Americans. Trucks lost. 0 German reconnaissance vehicles captured. November 1942. 8 trucks lost. 12 German reconnaissance vehicles captured or destroyed. December 1942. 3 trucks lost. 21 German vehicles captured or destroyed. A 78% reduction in Allied convoy losses. A 300% increase in German reconnaissance casualties. Conservative estimates credited the fence wire trap with saving 37 Allied trucks and approximately 90 lives between November 1942 and January 1943. The actual number was probably higher. Many convoys weren't attacked specifically because German reconnaissance had failed to locate them. Failed reconnaissance meant failed targeting. Failed targeting meant survival. The British Eighth Army noticed the change in mid-November. An intelligence officer tracked the convoy losses, noticed the sudden drop, started asking questions. He'd found the overturned SID KFZ vehicles, examined the wire marks on their axles, traced the technique back to American combat engineers. By December, he'd identified Bobby as the source. He'd filed a report recommending official adoption of the tactic. That report had reached the General Bernard Montgomery's staff on December 3rd. Montgomery had read it, approved integration into defensive doctrine, issued orders for British engineers to implement the wire trap at all vulnerable points along supply routes. The directive included precise specifications, wire gauge, stake positioning, tension requirements, deployment procedures. Everything Bobby had figured out through trial and error in a motor pool at 3 a.m. The directive didn't mention Bobby's name. Official documentation attributed the innovation to British 8 Corps engineering staff, working in cooperation with American advisors. Bobby hadn't been consulted. He'd learned about the directive from a British sergeant who'd shown him the printed orders and laughed. "Look at this. They're calling it the Montgomery trap. Like he invented it." Bobby had shrugged. Long as it works. He hadn't wanted credit. Credit meant attention. Attention meant questions about authorization, about court-martial risk, about working outside proper channels. Better to stay quiet. Better to let the generals take the glory while the mechanics saved lives. Bobby received no medal, no commendation, no official recognition of any kind. His personnel file noted only that he'd served with distinction in North Africa, then Italy, then France. He'd survived the war. That was enough. In 1947, Bobby returned to Youngstown. The steel mills were hiring. He'd gotten his old job back in the rail yards, replacing brake cables, rigging emergency stops. The work was familiar, comfortable. He could feel tension through his gloves again, know when a cable would snap before it showed wear. The skills that had saved 90 lives in North Africa were the same skills that kept ore cars from running away in Ohio. Simple physics, applied correctly. He never talked about the war. When people asked, he'd say he'd been an engineer, built bridges, fixed trucks. True enough. He didn't mention Morrison, didn't mention the wire trap, didn't mention the armored cars. Some things didn't translate to civilian conversation. How do you explain over dinner that you'd invented a way to kill people more efficiently, even if it was defensive, even if it saved lives? The math didn't make it easier to discuss. In 1952, Bobby received a letter from Dorothy Morrison, Frank's widow. She was remarrying, moving to California. She'd wanted Bobby to know, to thank him for writing after Frank died, to tell him that the letter had helped, that knowing Frank hadn't suffered had helped her grieve. Bobby had read that letter 3 times, then burned it. She didn't need to know Frank had suffered, didn't need to know about the bullet holes, the blood trail, the surprised expression. Some lies were kindness. Bobby worked the rail yards for 32 years. He retired in 1979, age 60. He'd saved enough for a small house in Warren, Ohio, 10 miles from Youngstown. He'd spent his retirement fixing cars in his garage, helping neighbors with mechanical problems, teaching his grandson about tension and stress and the way on metal remembers. He never mentioned the war. He died in 1998, age 79, of a heart attack in his garage. He'd been under a 1973 Ford pickup, replacing brake cables. The obituary in the Warren Tribune mentioned that he'd served in World War II, that he'd been a combat engineer, that he'd survived North Africa and Europe. It didn't mention the fence wire trap. It didn't mention Morrison. It didn't mention the 90 lives. The wire trap became standard doctrine. The British adopted it officially in December 1942. The Americans integrated it into field manuals in January 1943. The Soviets learned about it from captured German intelligence reports, implemented their own version in 1944. By 1945, every army in Europe knew about using wire to disable light vehicles. Post-war, the technique appeared in NATO defensive doctrine, Warsaw Pact training manuals, insurgent tactics handbooks. Modern military engineers still learn variations of it. Some still call it the Montgomery trap. In 2003, a military historian named Dr. Raymond Walsh was researching North African tactics when he found Bobby's name in a British intelligence report from December 1942. The report described the wire trap in detail, attributed its invention to Corporal Robert Henshaw, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Walsh had tracked down Bobby's service records, interviewed former members of his unit, reconstructed the story. He'd published a paper in the Journal of Military History titled Innovation Under Fire, the Henshaw Wire Trap, and the Democratization of Anti-Vehicle Tactics. The paper had won awards, generated discussion, led to the technique being properly credited in updated military histories. 60 years too late for Bobby to know about it. But history eventually finds the truth. Sometimes it just takes a while. In 2012, Bobby's grandson, Michael, read Walsh's paper. He'd been cleaning out his grandfather's garage, found a canvas bag containing 15 feet of fence wire and 2 tent stakes. The wire was old, rusty, but still strong. Michael had pulled it taut between his hands, felt the tension, wondered why his grandfather had kept it. Then he'd read the paper, understood. The wire and stakes are now in the U.S. Army Engineer Museum at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Display case 47B. Small placard. Henshaw wire trap prototype. North Africa, 1942. Credited with saving approximately 90 Allied lives through disruption of German reconnaissance operations. The wire shows rust. The stakes show sand pitting. Simple tools. Profound impact. That's the nature of innovation in war. It doesn't come from laboratories or design committees. It comes from mechanics who can't sleep, from engineers who remember friends dying, from people who refuse to watch one more man bleed out in the sand clutching a cigarette tin. It comes from working-class kids who learned physics in rail yards and applied it in deserts. It comes from people who understand that stopping something doesn't always require matching its force. Sometimes you just need to interrupt its balance. Bobby never got his medal. Never wanted one. He'd wanted Morrison alive. Wanted Dorothy to have her husband. Wanted those convoys to make it through. The wire trap hadn't saved Morrison, but it had saved the men who came after. That had to be enough. On cold mornings in Warren, Ohio, Bobby would stand in his garage, breath fogging, and remember the desert, the smell of diesel, fuel, and blood, the weight of Morrison's body, the sound of wire singing with tension, the sight of an armored car flipping, the knowledge that somewhere, in some convoy, a driver made it home because of 15 feet of fence wire and 2 tent stakes. He never called himself a hero. Heroes got parades. He'd gotten back to work. That was the real innovation, not the wire trap, but the understanding that saving lives doesn't require glory. It just requires being willing to act when everyone else is willing to watch. The fence wire and tent stakes in that museum case represent something fundamental about human nature. When doctrine fails, when official channels move too slowly, when people are dying and nobody with authority will listen, that's when innovation happens. Not through proper channels, not through approved methods, through mechanics working at 3 a.m. with bleeding hands and shaking fingers, through people who understand that sometimes the simplest answer is the right one, through individuals who'd rather risk court-martial than watch another friend die. That's how wars are actually won. Not through grand strategy, not through superior technology, through sergeants and corporals who refuse to accept that the current way is the only way, through working-class kids who learned practical physics in dangerous jobs and applied it to impossible situations, through people who understand that the line between coward and hero is often just the willingness to act when action seems pointless. Bobby Henshaw never thought of himself as special. He'd worked rail yards. He'd joined the army. He'd watched a friend die. He'd twisted some wire around some stakes. Simple sequence. No heroics. Just couldn't watch anymore. But in November 1942, 90 men made it home because he couldn't watch anymore. 90 men who would have died in burning trucks on desert roads. 90 men who got to finish their cigarettes, write their letters, see their wives again. 90 Dorothy Morrisons who didn't have to read condolence letters. 90 families who stayed intact. That's the legacy, not the wire trap itself, which any mechanic could have invented, but the decision to invent it despite the risk, the willingness to break rules when lives depended on it, the understanding that sometimes doing the right thing means ignoring the people in charge and trusting your own judgment. In 1952, Bobby stood outside a machine shop in Warren, watching a crew unload steel cable, same type he used in the rail yards, same type he'd used in North Africa. The foreman was showing a new hire how to coil it properly, how to feel the tension, how to know when it would hold. Bobby had watched for a while, hands in his pockets, breath fogging in the March cold. The new hire had dropped the cable twice, nervous, unsure. The foreman had been patient, showed him again. The third time, the kid got it right, felt the tension, smiled. Bobby had walked away, thinking about Morrison, about teaching him to drive the deuce and a half, about Morrison's smile when he'd finally mastered double clutching, about simple skills that keep people alive. That's how innovation actually survives. Not through museums or history papers, through young mechanics learning to feel tension in cable, through engineers who remember that simple tools solve complex problems, through the understanding that sometimes stopping something heavy doesn't require heavy weapons. Just knowledge, just willingness, just refusal to watch another man die when you know there's a better way. The fence wire in that museum case isn't just steel. It's proof that authority doesn't own solutions. That the best ideas often come from people who aren't supposed to have them. That working class kids from steel towns can save more lives than generals. That innovation happens in motor pools at 3 a.m., not in headquarters at noon. Bobby Henshaw died under a pickup truck, replacing brake cables, doing the same work he'd done his whole life, keeping things from running away, applying tension where it mattered, saving lives through simple physics and refusal to accept that good enough was actually good enough. 90 men came home because he couldn't accept it. 90 families stayed whole. 90 futures happened that wouldn't have otherwise. That's what 15 feet of fence wire and 2 tent stakes actually bought. Not tactical advantage, not military innovation, just 90 more men at 90 more dinner tables, telling 90 more stories to 90 more children who wouldn't have existed without a mechanic who worked rail yards in Youngstown and refused to watch his friends die in the desert. Thank you for keeping these stories alive, for remembering that heroes don't always wear medals. Sometimes they wear work gloves with blood on them and carry fence wire in canvas bags. Sometimes they die under pickup trucks at 79, unremembered, unrecognized. But their innovations survive. Their refusal to accept unnecessary death survives. Their simple solutions to complex problems survive. And that's enough. That has to be enough.